happy note.
Oh, yeah. The recording's in progress, you guys.
Excellent.
Oh, so anyway, how is everyone?
Hanging in there.
Good. Very good.
We have a very special guest tonight.
Very special.
Very
Super
special.
special. Extra special.
She's like,
Very
oh my God.
Okay.
Okay. So for our listeners, I think most of you know that we were all in the same sorority. And then there's Nancy was also in our sorority, and she was my roommate. So I love her and adore her. And I'm visiting her in Tampa right now. And so I wanted to invite her to come onto the show and be with all of us. And so she's our guest presenter tonight. Nancy, you're the first guest presenter we've ever had.
Yeah.
Welcome to Best Friends Sharing Interests.
Shake.
Welcome. We're so glad to have you tonight. So
So
anyways,
glad to be here.
yay. So I asked Nancy. Nancy she does immigration law. And so I asked
Another
her.
lawyer.
I know, another lawyer. All you fucking lawyers, man, I tell you.
Never have too many.
Yeah.
I know. Like when you guys kept saying like, oh, I'm good. Well, Nancy, you had decided to go to law school when you were still at Loyola.
Yes.
Yes, I remember that. I remember even thinking, she's crazy to go to law school. She's nuts.
And I was.
And then I graduated from college and I don't know, a year after, I'm like, I think I might go to law school. I'm crazy too.
Yeah. And then Carrie went and just, I don't know. It never occurred to me. I never wanted to. And especially after you all became attorneys, I was like, hell no. So I asked Nancy if she would be willing to talk about kind of like some immigration history for us. And so I will go ahead and actually start with a question that I asked her a few years ago. And it was such an interesting answer that I was like, I've got to ask this question. So, and it was about immigration law and how when it changed in the 90s, like what the effect was on like immigration in the United States. So I don't know, Nancy, do you want to take it from there?
Sure. So Mexican immigration to the US became pretty popular in the 1950s, and it remained sort of all the way through the 90s, a pretty similar activity. It was mostly young men who came without their families, and they would work the agricultural seasons, and they would go home every year. So they'd come, they'd work 6 to 9 months, they'd go home for 3 months, see the family, come back. By the time they're in their mid-30s to 40, they've saved enough money, they move back to Mexico permanently. And this was sort of the standard immigration story from Mexico. In 1996, they changed the law and they made crossing the border after you had been removed an actual crime and not just a civil violation. The first time you enter the United States without permission, that is a civil violation and not a crime. And before, they had always just treated every reentry as a civil violation. But now they start saying, you're actually going to do some serious jail time if we catch you if you come back after you've been deported. This made crossing the border back and forth every year much more dangerous and expensive for the migrants, and it began to change their patterns. So instead of going back and forth every year, they began to stay, and then they brought their families. So in the early 1990s, the number of undocumented workers in the United States was about 3 million. By 2007, it was 12 million. The law that had been intended to punish immigrants and to discourage them from coming had so changed their habits that it encouraged them to not only come, but stay permanently and have their families here. So it entirely changed the culture of the Mexican American experience coming into the United States.
Interesting.
So
I
are
had-
most
Yeah.
are most of those people coming into California and Texas? Or are they going farther?
Most of them are going farther.
Okay.
They still travel with the crops. So
Okay.
yes, they go to California, they go to Texas, but they come here to Florida, they go to
Yeah.
New York, they go to Ohio, they go to Iowa. Wherever farmers are bringing in crops,
Yeah.
they're going to be migrant workers there.
So I feel like there was like a map of the United States that shows like the number, or I guess the increase or decrease in immigration. And it was like really high in the Dakotas,
Yes.
right? Why is that? Like, do they grow a bunch of stuff there?
I mean, they do grow stuff in the summer, but there's also the oil fields. In the Dakotas there's a huge amount of employment opportunity, and they can't get enough workers there. I mean, a lot of Americans don't want to move to North Dakota.
Yeah.
So migrants tend to be less picky about where they're going to go. They're following the jobs. So
Oh, interesting. So, but then like, how do the employers get away with employing them?
Fake papers.
sometimes immigrants have fake papers and the employer honestly doesn't know. Sometimes the employer knows and they pay a fine if they get caught, and it becomes the cost of doing business.
Oh, interesting.
And it also depends on who the government is interested in pursuing. You know, there was a case out of Pottsville, Iowa. It was a kosher meat processing plant, and they had a lot of undocumented workers there. They were raided. The trial was actually held in a corral where they held the rodeo.
What?
They brought the judge in and they held the people in stalls where they kept animals. The
Oh
only
my.
reason that we know about this is because the translators that the government hired were so appalled by the conditions that they spoke out, even though they were actually employed by the government. They said, this is crazy. There were a lot of allegations of sexual abuse by the workers against the employers. It was as ugly as it could be. At the end of the day, the workers got deported. The employers got a fine. Nobody was prosecuted for any sexual assault.
When was this?
This was 2005.
Wow.
And the ironic thing about it is the kosher meatpacking plant was owned by Hasidic Jews out of New York. And they obviously still needed workers. So they got Somali refugees who were Muslim to come in and work at the meat processing plant, because a kosher slaughterhouse is not a place that's easy to work in. They do not allow for the mechanized killing of the animal. So you have to stand next to the animal and slit its throat in order for it to be kosher. So you have to have a human being who's willing to do that. This is kind of the job Americans won't do. So the Somali refugees, who were all Muslim, they did it. Then they wanted permission to stop 5 times a day to pray to Mecca. The owners said no, and they sued. So it ended up being a huge legal kerfuffle, and the poor people of Pottsville, Iowa were just wishing they had their Mexican migrants back.
Yeah. Wow.
So-
So fucked up.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
So
Mhm.
I grew up someplace that is always been someplace where immigrants came. And it's interesting because what we've seen as time goes on is that there is no one less sympathetic to new immigrants than former immigrants. Do you think that holds true across the board, Nancy? Like, I feel like that's an excellent example of the Hasidic Jews who clearly came to America at some point and created their own culture being like, yeah, we don't really care about you creating your culture?
I definitely think that there is a dynamic of shutting the barn door once you're inside.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, like everybody likes pulling up that ladder once they've made it. I think that I've seen that in a lot of different immigrant communities. I wouldn't say that is specific to Hispanics or specific to
No. I think
kids or
it's
whatever.
universal. I think it's pretty much across the board in my experience, but you have a much broader experience than I do, so I'm curious.
Right. Well, I definitely feel like, for example, Cubans, because they have historically had so much of an easier path of getting to the United States with the wet foot, dry foot policy that said that they could basically have asylum if they just stood up on US soil. They became, as a group, judgy of other peoples that didn't have such an easy path. Why didn't you just do it the legal way? Why didn't you just, well, because we don't all have the same options that the Cubans had. So
Yes.
there is a lot of resentment.
I can see that in St. Louis. We have a large population of Bosnians. There was a big Bosnian refugee stream came to us late 90s, early 2000s. So I hear a lot of that when there were Bosnians on my street, and yeah, they are definitely seem a little anti-immigrant, like, if they could, you do it legally or don't do it at all, kind of thing.
Is it like anti like specific other immigrants, like more like
I don't know. I wouldn't had specific conversations. It's not like I sit there and have political. Once you kind of realize there's a little resentment, you don't really dig deeper. At least that's what I do.
So where I grew up there, it's very specific to the idea that when the French Canadians and the Irish came to this part of the world, nobody did them any favors. And therefore, why do we need to do you favors? Because you're coming from the Middle East or Africa or somewhere else. But the people who are exhibiting those feelings are generally second or third generation, established in the area, who still consider themselves to have ties and consider that to be their family legacy, is this, this story of pulling up by the bootstraps. And they want other people to do the same thing, regardless of the realisticness of that option or not.
Right. And I think that a lot of people, especially if they're not immigrants themselves, but they are first or second generation immigrants, they have this sense of, we did it the right way. Why don't you do it the right way? But the reality is, for most people who enter without documentation, there is no reasonable legal path. The reality is, if you don't have a close family member, a spouse, parent, child, or brother or sister who is a US citizen, there is no family path for you. And for employment, if you don't have a college education, there are 10,000 green cards a year available for people who don't have a college degree. If there are 12 million people without papers, it's over 1,000-year line for them to get a green card. If the line is 1,000 years long, does it exist?
crazy? That's a very existential question there, Nancy.
Very deep for this podcast.
we don't usually
go
get
out on
that
a limb
deep.
and say no, the line doesn't exist.
I think a lot of people really like the fiction that there is this magical legal path that people are too lazy or greedy or stupid to use. And if they only did it the right way, we wouldn't have any problem with them. But that's just not true. We've drafted our immigration laws in order to be as restrictive as possible. And then we blame them when they come a different way. And yet we don't really punish employers for hiring without papers. If you follow the money, business is who primarily wins in the financial stakes of immigration.
Why do you think businesses don't push to have more visas for these migrant workers?
I think businesses like a workforce with no rights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm.
These people can't get workers' comp. They can't file a complaint if they're not treated well or not paid. You know, they have to take what they can get. A permanent underclass of workers with no rights is very good for big business.
And they never, ever, ever unionize
Yeah,
Right.
because it's just not in the cards for them.
it's not.
Yeah, that's so creepy. The way you said that. I mean, it's just one step away from slavery, really.
Well, and the thing too is that, like, talking to people who live that life, like where I grew up, we had lots of Jamaicans who came every year to pick apples, and you would see the same people year in and year out, and they were, you know, while they were not working in great conditions in comparison to what they were going home to and what they had available to them on their very small island, they were like, they felt like they were the kings of the hill.
Yeah,
Mm.
So
and
like
then
there's a lot of like perspective involved too.
they probably had an H-2 visa, which is a seasonal agricultural visa, of which there are not enough.
Yeah.
So most people can't get those visas. And if they had them, then they did have some protections, and their lives were so much better than people who were without documentation.
Yeah. So crazy.
Yeah, it's nuts. All kinds of nuts.
So what do you think, like if you had a magic wand to wave to fix everything and it actually happened, what would you want to do?
I would want an immigration system that was much more responsive to the actual needs of the economy, where the rights of the immigrants were considered as part of the equation. I think that our system is cumbersome, it's difficult, it doesn't meet the needs of business. You know, I think it was in 2012 that Microsoft opened a big headquarters in Vancouver because they couldn't get enough they couldn't get the visas that they needed to bring workers into Seattle. So then rather than expanding in Seattle, they moved to Vancouver. I think that that's a shame. That's a loss to the American economy. A lot of these immigrant jobs on the higher end, you know, they're H-1Bs. You have to make at least $60,000 a year to even think about getting an H-1B. These are good taxpayer jobs. They're going to be benefit to the economy. I don't understand why there's only 65,000 available every year. That, to me, if we have employers that can pay them and can prove that that there aren't U.S. workers who could do the job, if these jobs are going unfilled, why are we limiting that visa? I think that we need a smarter system and a more compassionate system. I think that the fact that there's almost no forgiveness for making a mistake in immigration law creates a lot of tragedy. I think we used to have a system where if you made a mistake, you went out of status, you could pay a fine and get back into status. Well, in 96, they got rid of that. So if you overstay for a year and you leave, you can't come back for 10 years. If you overstay for 6 months and you leave, you can't come back for 3 years. These are very harsh conditions to put on people for not realizing that the visa expired or believing their employer when they told them that they extended it when they didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think.
Go ahead, Kathy.
Oh, I was just gonna say. So the company that Nick works for, it's a big global company, but they have consolidated what was, I think, originally 3, but for many years just 2 American plants into one plant in North Carolina, but most of their stuff is made in Mexico. They built a plant a long time ago in Mexico, and when Nick goes to the plant in Mexico, he's like, "There's people there. They're working. They're happy to be working. They're, every station has multiple people at it working. And when he goes to the plant in North Carolina, he's like, there's huge billboards on your way in advertising that they're hiring, all the salaries, all the benefits. It's like they can't get people to work in the plant in North Carolina, and they're making almost everything out of Mexico because they can't get people to work.
for the plant in North Carolina. And I was like, and he's like, he's like, there's no one there that wants the jobs. And he's like, and they're good jobs, good benefits, good stuff. And I was like, well, it sounds like they should just, bring people from Mexico to come work in the plant. But
Right, because
obviously they can't.
if they came here and they worked in North Carolina, then they would pay taxes in North Carolina. They would pay federal income taxes. It would
Buy
be
property and
buy property. They would invest in other things. They would live lives and be productive. And I just think the way the H-1B program, which is a professional worker visa, you have to have a college education in order to apply for it. And like I said, you have to make at least $60,000 a year. The way that they work is you sign up for a registration, and then the computer randomly selects the first, 65,000. And if you don't get selected, you don't get an H-1B for that year. You can try again a year later. So the lottery happened, the registration lottery happened. They're estimating 15% of applicants got registered.
wow.
So this means that they had an employer with an open job who had found an immigrant who had a college degree, who could do the job, who wanted to come to America, and only 15% are going to even get a chance to file for the H-1B. And that to me is crazy. Why are we turning people away who would be such an asset to the country?
I have a question, Nancy, and I realize that you're probably the right person to ask. Is there a legal difference between an immigrant and a refugee?
Yes.
Can you tell me what it is?
Yeah. A refugee is a very specific kind of immigrant. It is somebody who has been forced out of their homeland and ended up in a UN refugee camp somewhere in the world. That camp will talk to the people who are there and say, where do you want to go? Do you want to go to Germany? Do you want to go to the United States? Do you want to go to Canada? Where do you have people? Where do you have connections? What languages do you speak? What countries are willing to take you? So the UN camp matches the refugee with the country. The average length of time a person spends in a refugee camp is 10 years.
Wow.
So like, for example, there were a lot of people out of Vietnam who went to refugee camps in Thailand and Laos after the Vietnam War because they fought with Americans, and then they were in a lot of trouble in Vietnam.
Yeah.
The last of those came to the United States right around 1990.
Oh, wow.
So
A lot of
that's
them were
a
New
long
Orleans.
time to live in a refugee camp.
A lot of them are in Texas, in Houston specifically,
Yeah.
from
Uh,
Vietnam. Yeah,
We have
Yeah.
New Orleans.
large Vietnamese population.
The next thing that's similar to that is an asylum seeker. An asylum seeker is somebody who approaches the US border and asks for asylum. They have not been pre-vetted by the UN or anybody. They come with a claim saying, I will suffer extreme hardship if I'm forced to return to my home country. And then they ask basically to be allowed in the United States for a chance to go in front of the asylum office, and then usually the immigration judge as part of a removal proceeding to determine whether they have a credible fear of persecution.
Okay.
About 97% of asylum cases are denied. If you have a really good lawyer, it's about 80% denial rate.
Yikes.
So those are the people that show up at the border without papers and surrender themselves and say, I want to stay. I fear, I have a credible fear. And it has to be very specific. It has to be either from your government or from a group your government cannot or will not control. And it has to be because of a specific thing about you, a membership in a particular social group, political opinion. They have to be deliberately targeting you not just it sucks to be a woman in Honduras. That's not enough. It has to be, I was at a rally, they took my name, they beat me up, they tortured me, I escaped, and now I'm running for my life because they're hunting me, because I did something.
Right.
A case that I can tell you that was an asylum case that was approved is, I was out of Eastern Europe, and a man was a journalist, and he was set to interview a man who was running for the office of president in his country against the incumbent president. And they were set to meet in a hotel room and in the conference room. And he's waiting in the hotel for him. He looks out the window and he sees the street below, and he sees the man that he's supposed to interview walking towards the hotel when some men get out of a car and they shoot him.
Oh my.
And my client saw the men. And then the newspaper published his name, saying he was a witness to the assassination of the political opponent of the president.
Okay,
So he ran.
there's your editor not liking you, and then there's your editor actually being out to get you.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure if it was his paper or a competing paper, but at his asylum hearing, we had we had the original paper and the translation that said he witnessed this political, and he saw the killers.
Yeah.
And that was an approvable case.
Yeah.
A
Wow.
case that wasn't approved was out of South America. It was another journalist. There was an on-air personality and then the cameraman. And they were doing stories about the FARC, which is a not great group out of Colombia. And the on-air personality disappeared. Nobody ever saw him again. He never used his bank accounts. His wife never saw him. So the cameraman, who had been receiving death threats, but they were all on the phone, they didn't send it on like FARC stationery, dear sir. But he would get these phone calls that say you're dead and things like that. So he ran. He got into the United States and he claimed asylum. He was denied. They said he couldn't prove that the on-air personality was dead. He could be living somewhere else and be fine. And so he was deported back to Colombia.
Oh my God. Yeah.
So asylum is not an easy standard to meet.
Oh, clearly not.
Wow.
Clearly not.
I have a question. I don't know if you can speak to this. This is definitely, it's a claim you hear in the news a lot from people, certain people in this country, that think that these immigrants are coming into our country and committing crime after crime after crime. What is your response to that allegation?
A lot of that is they're saying the fact that they entered is a crime. So if you exclude immigration violations, it's just factually not true. Statistically, immigrants, both documented and undocumented, commit crimes at a much lower rate than US citizens. They are much more concerned about being removed from the country. So they're going to be more careful about following the law and doing what they're supposed to do. The last thing an undocumented person wants to do is draw attention to themselves. And committing a crime in most states is a really good ticket to get yourself in removal proceedings. Obviously, there are organized drug gangs and there are, criminal elements in any group, but statistically it is lower than a general pool of US citizens.
Okay. That was my understanding. But then I keep hearing it come up on certain.
Well, again, the way they play
I see.
that is they're including immigration violations as crimes. So if you include that, then 100% of undocumented people have committed an infraction. And therefore, you can say 100% of immigrants are not law abiding, because the very fact that they're here without papers means they have violated a law. But if you exclude immigration violations, it just isn't true.
Very logical. That makes perfect sense.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Confirming my thought on the matter. I just wanted to make sure I was right. Of
Yeah.
course,
You're,
it's right.
you're almost always right, aren't you, Lisa?
Yes, I am. Thank you for confirming that. With all my others, my husband would agree. He agrees to my face. I don't know what he says behind my back.
That's awesome. Yeah, I don't. This is kind of like, so, I live in Houston, and I was driving. It's kind of like a random thing, but I was driving down the street, and I recall there was a woman, like she looks South American, at least, I don't know, like Hispanic, and she was in a car, and like I was trying to do a turn, and it was like very clear that she had the right of way, but she seemed afraid to like do it because she was afraid of pissing me off. Do you know it? And I was like, it has to be, and I don't know if it's true. Maybe it was just my perception of it, but it really, it was almost like she's trying to hide herself. And I was like, it's so sad that people feel that way, like they feel like they're afraid to just be out there or to drive normally. I don't know, you know what I'm saying? Like to follow the laws, that would be normal, and to turn when she would turn because she's afraid that I might like turn her in, or I don't know.
Well,
It
because
goes beyond that, unfortunately, because I think a lot of times they're also afraid to report crimes when they happen to them because they're afraid, even if they're here legally, having a spotlight shown on their greater family, most likely like they might be legal, but uncle whoever who's living with them may not be. And so they're afraid to report crimes when they happen to them. They're afraid to seek other types of services, even whether they're here legally or not, again, for that scrutiny, because maybe they have family members who aren't, but also, just, I think there's just a fear of government and government services, even when the service might, they're not going to, they're just there to help, like a health service for their kids or whatever, right? Or like, free clinic aid and things like that. Like they're just afraid to use it. And you see that all the time, especially here in Houston and Texas, because we have a high percentage of all kinds, all kinds of immigrants, and, whether legal or not legal or H-1B. I mean, I know tons of people in my industry here on H-1B. So I think there's just this kind of distrust that comes along with it that is unfortunate because, there's all kinds of things that happen where, they may live in an apartment complex and, there's violations that the owners know this, right? And so they're like, yeah, we're not going to fix, the shitty, plumbing or, whatever sewage leaks and whatever happens because they know that no one's going to turn around and contact the government for help.
Right. And even if you're here legally, if you want to be able to sponsor a relative to come, you have to prove that, they're not going to be a public charge, that you would have to be able to sponsor them. If you have received benefits in the US, then it's going to be very challenging for you to then turn around and say, I can sponsor my mom, I can sponsor my sister, whatever, because the government will say, well, how can you vouch for them? How can you say you'll take care of them when you can't even take care of yourself? People are very afraid to take any kind of government aid, even people who are legal, who have the right to it, because they're just afraid that it's going to, even if it's not part of the consensus, what they look at today, that it will be in the future. And Trump did that when he changed a lot of the immigration protocols and asked a lot of questions about what types of benefits have you received as a sponsor that had never been asked before. And that had a real chilling effect on legal immigrants getting help they need for their US citizen children, for other, because they were just afraid this is going to mess up my petition that I have pending for mom, or, that I have for my sister. Because it takes such a long time for family immigration. Like right now, If you're not from China, India, Mexico, or the Philippines, which runs slower, it takes about 17 years to petition for a brother or sister. So
Crazy.
Oh.
Yeah, like I don't think as I'm fairly certain that all of us were born here. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think we realize how valuable American citizenship is considered to be. I have a very good friend from when I worked in Virginia who did not find out from her husband until after they were engaged that his mother was actually American and that he had dual citizenship between here and the Philippines. And therefore they could move to the US because her husband never disclosed that to anyone he was dating because he was so concerned that they would turn on the charm just to get to America.
yeah,
And I was like, Maria, is that like I can't, like, they're like super duper close. And it's like, she's like, no, she said, I had no idea. He did not tell me until we were already engaged. I was like, I just can't, like, that's crazy to me. But I mean, it's a very valuable piece of paper. It's a very valuable opportunity.
I remember the first time traveling in Europe and reading about different stuff and saying how like to keep that American passport like close to you, like with you everywhere you go, because it's, so valuable, on the red market to just sell an American passport. So
yes.
I don't
And
think I fully understood at the time what that meant.
you will
but-
get hassled at the border till the end of time if your passport is stolen and used by someone else.
Mm,
Like that.
oh, sure.
Mm.
Like you
And
did it.
then-
You were sharing your
Well,
passport.
no, well, every time you come in, you're gonna have to confirm it's you. So that goes to secondary inspection. They're gonna have to fingerprint you, they're gonna take your picture, they're gonna confirm in their records that you are you. Well, if you're on a plane with, a big international flight, let's say, it could easily have 500 people on it. They're gonna clear that whole plane out before they deal with the secondary inspection people, of which there'll probably be 10 to 12. So you will wait in a room waiting to talk to somebody for that whole time. If there's a connection, you're going to miss it.
Mm.
And it's a huge hassle.
I
So
bet.
keep your passport safe.
Well, and the other thing that I learned, and Drea, I actually learned this from Mike. Mike was telling me this at one point. Keep your elderly relatives' passports safe. Because one of the biggest issues with fake passports is like one of the biggest places that they get them is elderly people who just have them in a drawer that are, they're not going to use them. They're just laying around. And like, we always just assumed my grandmother's was lost because like, we never saw it. And Mike was like, no, you can't just assume it's lost because like it could definitely be stolen. Like that's how a lot of these get onto the market. Like it never occurred to me that you needed to be that careful with it.
If you're
Right.
missing your passport in a suspicious circumstance or the passport of a relative or whatever, you need to report that to the Department of State as soon as possible, because that will put it on a watch list that other people can't use it. But you need to notify them because you do not want someone else coming in on your loved one's name
No, certainly
And-
not.
using their identity.
Why did they return the passport that has expired when you get a new passport then?
They return it because it may very well have a visa stamp from a different country in it that is still valid. So it's very common for me as an immigration lawyer that I will have to have more than one passport for my clients because they may have a tourist visa to the United States that's good for 10 years, but maybe there was only 8 years left on their passport when they got it. So they have a 10-year visa in an 8-year left passport. Then when they get a new passport, they'll enter on the new passport, but they'll have to show the visa from the previous country, from the previous entries. So they end up entering with both passports. So since it's too much of an administrative burden for them to figure out who's really going to need that passport back and who's not, that's why they send it back.
I wish they would tell you that. I mean, because I got mine back, so I changed my last name, and I got my old one back. And I'm like, am I supposed to sell this now? Which I mean, I know I'm not.
No, don't do that. No.
I don't think Nancy, Rick, give that legal advice to people. Nike makes some extra money.
Yeah.
New old passports.
This is like gold. What if you
Well, I mean, we
rented it
just
out?
got,
What
we
if
just
you
got
rented
Charlie's
out?
renewed. Because he was, his expired.
Yeah.
And then they,
You know, when they're young, they expire quickly, don't they?
they do, yes. And it's a whole new passport. It's not actually officially a renewal. You have to go through the entire process all over again. Just FYI for those out there, but do better out passports. But then they send it, and then they send the old one back. And it's like,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
I guess if you're a scrapbooker, maybe you want all those stamps.
Well, some people keep them. Some people like to keep them. Some people like to destroy them. I would keep all your if you're keeping it, keep it together with your new existing passport. Don't get sloppy about guarding the old one.
Oh, okay.
You know, it can still be used for identity theft. It's better to keep it safe. So either destroy it or keep it safe with your existing passport.
So do you think that on the black market, like, on the not black market, like on the regular market, Zayla will rent like not prom dresses, but like dresses to go to formals, and then and then like send it back. And so do you think that you could, like, people might on the black market do that with passports? Like, you could rent my passport for X amount of dollars and then give it back to me?
I'm certain that they do that. Organized gangs use passports of people that, either they've stolen them or that people are part of the gang. And you get the passport at the airport in your country. So let's just say, you're in Helsinki and you meet the coyote and he hands you the passport. And then there will be somebody to meet your plane once you've cleared customs in the US, and they will take that passport from you and it will disappear. But it
So
is a
I was
very
right.
common- yeah, it's very common.
Is it me
It
or
is
is it?
illegal. Don't do it.
I did not have any money on Nancy actually ending up living in the Bourne Identity, and I feel like I should have put money on that because it's clearly coming true. She knows all this stuff and all these people all over the world. I just never saw it coming, Nancy. I think it's awesome, but like I never saw it coming.
Are your clients like the drug cartel or something? And
No,
alerting
actually
this to?
not. I have
Okay.
great clients.
Good to know.
Well, that brings
What?
up another point. And like all the people out there with all the fake passports, think of like if you've got 6 fake, like really good though, but fake passports, they all have to have fake expirations on them. So you got to keep track of like all of those fake passports and like, man, my German passport's about to expire. Now I got to go back to the fake passport guy and get it renewed.
Right? You have to be really
usually-
organized.
Yeah.
Usually you don't use the fake passport more than once. You get in, they take
Oh.
it back from you, and you're just here. Now you're here undocumented, you live your life. You're not going to travel again.
Well, I'm talking about like the Jason Bourne types who have like a secret safe box somewhere.
I
with, like,
don't have
6
those
fake
clients.
passports. Come on, Nancy.
I've heard though. So Mike, I always feel like I have to say like Monkey Mike, but you guys know who I'm talking about. He does do passport fraud, like in his job, and he told me it's incredibly difficult to counterfeit or a passport. Like that it's not like it would be much easier to like steal one and use
Right.
a real one than it would be to try to create one.
You should see these brand new ones, these brand new US ones, the one that Charlie just got. I mean, you basically have to be someone who works at the passport office and somehow be able to fake one without someone noticing because, I mean, what they're doing now to these passports, it's like, it's impressive. It's not
Well,
just like
now
one piece of paper.
The passports need to have a machine readable strip on them.
Yeah.
So it's no longer a question of the border agent looking at you, looking at the picture in the passport and saying, yeah, it looks like you, go on in. They're going to swipe your passport. And if the strip doesn't read right, you're not coming in. You know? So
Well,
it's very
now they have-
challenging.
Now they
That's why
also, in addition, they have a QR code and they have one of the pages is like like a heavy laminated type of page,
Yeah.
like a
And they'll
like
have
credit
holographic
card.
images also
Yeah. Yep.
that are very hard to duplicate.
Yep.
And the same with green cards. They change the green card every few years. They add security features. If you keep a green card, you have to renew it every 10 years. And that's really just because they think any green card that's been on the market for 10 years has been successfully counterfeited. And they've added security features and they've done things to make it more difficult to counterfeit over the time. So every few years, there's some little change or some variation in the green card that as the counterfeiters get better, then the green card has to adapt. And the same with the passports. So it's one of the reasons that passports expire, is they do want to keep up with the modern technology and make sure that they have the passports as difficult as possible to counterfeit, which is why people steal them. And it's why sometimes a US citizen will sell them, because a valid passport is an incredibly valuable document.
So are green cards really green?
At the moment, yes.
Yeah.
They
were
could-
for the-
They
for-
could fake you out in the future and make
They
them
were
blue.
green in the 50s when the name came. The legal term is lawful permanent resident, but green card's easier to say. But they were pink and then they were yellow, and now they have different colors on them, but green is definitely a primary color. So people
That
are
was
always
a
excited
decent
to see that they're
question.
green.
It's a good question. I liked it. Excellent.
Yeah,
I feel more knowledgeable already.
I know. Nancy, you filled our brains with a lot of extra good information.
So, I have a question for Nancy. If you could wave a wand and enact 3 immigration laws, what would they be?
I would go back to allowing people to pay a fine to fix their immigration status rather than face the 3 and 10-year bar. I think that is a lot more commiserate with the severity of their offense. I mean, because the fine used to be $1,500. It wasn't cheap.
Yeah.
I'm okay with the fine being expensive, but I think a fine is a more fair punishment for messing up your immigration than a 10-year bar. I would increase the family quota so that families would be reunited more quickly. I think the length of time that takes is very sad. And I would increase the number of H-1B visas.
Do we have enough people working in immigration in the government?
No,
Well,
especially the Department of State that runs the embassies.
Yeah.
There was a major gutting of the consular services while Trump was president. Not to get too political, but 60% of the consular workers who were there at the beginning of his presidency were not there at the end, and they were not replaced. The understaffing at our embassies is crazy.
sounds dangerous too.
Yeah.
It just causes major delays, and people wait and wait and wait for an appointment. I have a client from Jamaica whose sister has qualified for the visa. I mean, she waited the 17 years, okay? And the visa became current in 2019. And we filed all the paperwork. We have done everything. We have kept up with the case. We have done every single thing we needed to do on time. Her sister's still not here. We're hoping maybe this summer.
Wow.
But 2019 to now, after waiting the 17 years for the visa to become current, is a crazy length of time. And that's purely because of staffing.
Wow.
Wow. And, they say there's this immigration crisis. It's like, well, if you staffed the agency that's trained to, manage that, it might help.
Yeah, but they don't want it. They want the crisis because both sides campaign on the crisis. Nobody wants to fix the problem because everybody's making hay off the problem.
Like, and there's no impetus to fix it on the federal levels because the states are the ones who end up paying for a lot of the aid for these people. when they come. At least that's the situation where I live, and that's always like the rub is that the state representatives are talking about immigration. It's like, you guys, the federal people are talking about it. And it's like, you guys don't pay any of this. Like, it's all the city and the state who's paying for it.
Right.
Well, my
And
state
most-
just decided to bust them away.
Right. Yikes. Well, my state at one point, the city that I grew up in, the mayor, who's the husband of one of my father's former long-term employees, published an open letter saying, listen, y'all need to stop inviting your families because, like, we can't take any more of you.
Wow.
Which was like a huge deal when it happened, and rightfully so. But at the same time, like, it's a relatively small town in central Maine. Like, they were not set up for not just immigrants, but non-English speaking Muslim immigrants with, a completely different, like, who had never seen cold weather, who had never, like, it was just, it was a lot. It was definitely a lot. So yes, like, I don't think there's any state that has an unblemished record on being nice to immigrants. I think they all have their moments where things get a little dicey.
Well, it's easy to be compassionate until you've got the budget in front of you.
Correct.
And then you got to disappoint somebody. And people who aren't voters are easier to disappoint.
True.
Yeah,
That's very true. Very true. And the other thing is that, like all things, like when you get right up close with people, it's easy to make judgments, shall we say. And it's like, immigration, like, refugees as a concept is like, yeah, we should help those people. And then it's like, oh my God, like 3/4 of the kids at my kid's school don't speak English. Like, like maybe I feel slightly differently about this. So, like, I can see where, like, up close and personal is always a little bit different than the theoretical concept.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. We have time for one more question. If there are more questions, I had 2 subjects that we were going to go over, and the other one was basically immigration racism over the last, 300 years.
But since that hardly exists, it's really not worth covering.
No. It's kind of biting my tongue. I was going to make some historical references. I'm like, well, that's off topic. I'm not going to go there.
Well, what we need to do is have Nancy back,
There you go.
Absolutely.
because you are a font of knowledge. I don't know about the rest
Font
of you
of knowledge.
guys, but I have learned quite a bit, and I talk
Yes.
to Nancy frequently.
I know nothing about immigration laws. So it's very interesting.
So,
Thank you, Nancy.
I
You're
feel
welcome.
smarter already.
all right. Well, I guess maybe there are no more questions.
Now, I've depressed you enough for one night.
No. You have educated us, and we really appreciate it. So,
Wait, I do have one more question. I'm sorry.
okay.
Nancy,
Yeah.
why did you pick immigration law? 'Cause clearly it's not the most uplifting option.
Now, 2 things. One, I graduated from law school and my husband still had a semester left of college, and we knew we were moving to Florida. So I went to Florida, took the bar, and then I went back to Oklahoma to be with him until he graduated. I needed something to do. That I wasn't a licensed lawyer yet, so I couldn't do much, but I didn't want to have 6 months of dead time on my resume. So I looked around for what my options were, and Catholic Charities needed help. And they have an immigrant assistance program. So I had taken immigration law in law school and hated it. But I thought,
No.
I'm going to do this. And I found out that when it was really helping people, that I liked it, that I respected immigrants, that one thing that really bothers me in people in general is when they're unhappy and they won't do anything to fix it. They just want to complain and blame other people and whine about it, but they don't want to make the hard choices and the changes that would actually make their lives better. And there's a bravery to immigrants where they weren't happy in their life, whatever reason they have for coming to the United States, whether it's economic or freedom or love, whatever, they weren't happy where they were, and they're willing to take a chance on something better. And I can really respect people who have that mentality that they're going to try, and it may not work, but they're not going to just sit home and cry.
Excellent reasons. Well done. Yeah. I feel well answered. I'm always curious how people end up where they end up. So that's a very logical way to end up there.
Absolutely. All right. Well, it's been awesome. Thank you guys for, all getting together. So good night.
It
And we'll
was
see you
Good to
next
see everybody.
week. Love
Bye.
you.
Good night. See you
See you,
soon.
Anthony.
Thanks,
Yep, see you
Nancy.
soon.